Hello, everybody, and welcome to the session at 4 p.m. Pacific time, 7 p.m. out east. And what time is it in Melbourne right now, folks?
9 a.m.
9 a.m. Just starting your day, but it's tomorrow, so you can tell us what happened. It's the future paradox.
So far, a good day.
So with that, I'd like to hand over the reins to the folks from University of Melbourne and University of Queensland. They're going to talk about faculty assessment practices in response to COVID-19, opportunities for innovative futures in changed worlds. Kate, and Christine, please take it away.
And Patsy, who's joining us. Thank you, Kevin. So many lovely opportunities for ABLE that we as a team have all been a part of for some years. So it's exciting to be here today. I want to first acknowledge the country that I'm meeting you and that I work on, the country owned by the peoples of the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung, Bunurong and Boonwurrung peoples. I acknowledge their living culture and unique ownership and education and living culture in this region. And I acknowledge that sovereignty has not been ceded in this country. I also acknowledge the place of education, particularly in reflective practice and restorative justice in the place of this work. So thank you for joining us. And for those of you who catch us up later in the video, this session will be around a couple of big ideas that have emerged during COVID-19 for us. So we are 4 practitioners who've been in the ePortfolio space for some time. But through our work with ePortfolios Australia, began to think about what are the other kinds of opportunities that we might need to consider. We came together in 2020 to think about what a collaboratory might look like. And it's good to see Megan's study. And I was a part of earlier ABLE studies when we were mapping projects some years ago. But what does it look like to do that kind of collaborative work that ePortfolio people do, to do a little bit more of the activism work through research and particularly in educational research, to consider what it is that we offer and what the affordances of our pedagogies and practices are and how they might impact on policy. A lot of ePortfolio work advocates for practice and pedagogical shift, but what does it actually look like and what might we actually be able to achieve? So this study is actually the title of a funded research project funded by ASCALITE, which is the Australasian society here for us in computers and in learning and teaching, and Desire to Learn, LMS, who put out this kind of call for research during 2021 to have a think about what the kinds of impacts at the time of the blended, flipped, remote emergency teaching pivot every other term that we can call what we've just done. It was particularly of interest to Kate and I at the University of Melbourne because Melbourne was one of the longest lockdowns globally in a very tumultuous 2 years or 2.5 years. We're really just emerging from in Melbourne at the bottom of Australia. So the study is Kate, we call ourselves the ePortfolio Kates because we're about to convene the ePortfolio Australia conference here later in the year. Our wonderful colleague and friend, Professor Patsy Polly from the University of New South Wales, Sydney, and Associate Professor Christine Slade. Now, key to this project is the now Dr. Kelly Anderson, who was in the late stages of her PhD at this time. And we will explain what that looks like methodologically, but a contribution that we make really is around the methodologies that we use to explore what it is that we do. We know that a lot of ePortfolio work includes a lot of surveys. For those of us that have been in this a long time, they get a little bit tiring. They ask the same questions over and over again. Are they successful? What did they find? Do students like them? And then we look at staff and we think about shift and change. But what's actually underpinning it is what we wanted to get into. So it begins with this provocation. And I think I provoke all of you who are listening or participating to think about what it means to work in collaboratories as ePortfolios. Practitioners, because collaboratories, we know, are the first place we go to when we want to discover ePortfolio practice. We go to the people because we know from those people, from ABLE, from ePortfolios Australia, from our institutional ePortfolio colleagues, that in those spaces we actually find our like-minded colleagues where we can actually talk about what the implementation of ePortfolios might look like, or portfolio pedagogies might look like in our subjects and courses and programs. So we commenced with a bunch of what if questions that we actually posed to our community. What if, and then what? So what if we came together to think about what this collaboratory might do? What might we explore? And then what might we imagine and then reimagine about the scholarship of teaching and learning? Underpinning this as educational researchers, and not all from education, was what we can actually contribute to the scholarship of teaching and learning community, and how we can start to use those scholarly communities more in ePortfolio research. What does SOTL actually mean? What does it contribute to? How might we use it as a body of literature and a community of practice to encourage uses around portfolio assessment? And what does the assessment then begin to afford, which was what we began to wonder together. So inside that collaboratory, that meant that we were also committed to co-designing. Now, we know that these seem like the kinds of languages we use in ePortfolio practice all the time. We sit down alongside colleagues, alongside academic developers, alongside learning designers, educational technologists. Those practices of co-design are pretty important in ePortfolio practice. We know we can't do them alone. You can't just grab a tool and plug it in. They must be co-designed in a range of ways. Co-designing technologies into the learning design, co-designing with learning designers so that we can actually come up with new solutions together. So the important part of that is that we would be a true collaboratory. How did we actually share ideas, pull apart the collaboratory as we needed in terms of thinking about the way that labs work? You know, there's a provocation or an idea, a speculation, a hypothesis in the center, and around that are these collaborative practices. To then think about how we might co-design potential solutions. And underpinning that, really, if you just think about the ways that you've implemented ePortfolios, this seems pretty usual. But what does it look like when you actually start to do that as a research community is something a little different on top of that. We would explore best practice and whatever it is that means, but it is the jargon, at least in the Neoliberal Academy in Australia. What does best practice look like? What is the evidence of that best practice, and how might we come to understand that? And to interrogate some shared problematics. You know, I think one of the best things that come out of ePortfolio conferences are the fail stories. And in design language, the kind of fail fast and fail up methodology is an important one. And that means that we're actually learning from those problematics and troubling them more and interrogating what sits at the center of those things. And then to speculate on what those are. How can we wonder about shifting those practices? What is it that we actually need to do? What are the policies that already exist in assessment within our institutions? And how do our institutions talk about what assessment is, particularly during times of COVID? We've seen a subtle change in the way that institutions speak about assessment. We've seen less subtlety around the ways that we speak about teaching and learning, using, you know, really sporting methodology or sporting metaphor around pivot, around shifting, around snapback. These kind of words make us start to think differently about what learning and teaching and assessment are, but what do they actually look like? And then how might we showcase it? So it's not a short project, and nothing collaboratory is. These are living inquiries that we do together, and much like the ways that we talk about portfolios are, you know, they're long projects that take time, because a multitude of people are bringing all different practices together to think about how we might contribute into what assessment practices are or might be as a result of the pandemic. So a collaborative methodology means that there are always these returns. And the return in a collaborative methodology, if you haven't worked in one before, ensures that there are a number of iterative and emergent findings that build out of prototyping. They come from defining the challenge. And so part of the initial challenge is, what does it look like for 4 ePortfolio practitioners in 4 very different places within their institutions, 4 very different roles, using portfolios in very different ways? What does it look like first for us to come together and think about what we might look at? So defining the challenge, which we used in most institutions. A grant application is a good way to define a challenge because it already has a set of constraints and parameters around it. It asks you to engage in a particular way. We found this application from Ascolite and D2L. We defined this challenge and we set about thinking about how we would establish it, how we would evaluate what the opportunity of the 4 of us coming together might mean, and then to start to define some assumptions. That meant that we wanted to use and be true to a co-design, which meant that the centering as design practitioners meant to put a designer in the middle of it. And so we went about shifting the way that the team would function. So this kind of front loading, I think, is really important in thinking around the ways that you currently practice in ePortfolio research, and what is that research actually trying to achieve, and who are the people in the research teams with you, and are you researching them, or are you just working within them and using the scholarship of teaching and learning that is building from the huge communities of ePortfolio practitioners around you? And if you work out a problematic in that space, how might you actually use a co-design method to almost, put a stop mark in some of that scholarship of teaching and learning and pull out a bit that you want to explore in your own institution or your own broader community of practice. So co-design is about co-creating. And the important part of this is that it's with stakeholders. So again, like I said, this is pretty, normal and useful language for those of us working in this field. And for anyone working in change making in the institution, we know that co-design is incredibly important, because without it, we can make as many decisions as we want about change, but it's very hard to bring people with us. And for those of us in ePortfolios, we also know that that's really difficult without really sitting down and working really closely in collaborations with people. So the design of the CoLab inquiry needs to be a focus. There's a commitment to speculating. And I think that this is a little bit different from many people who don't come from education research or from design-based education research, that there is no hypothesis because there's nothing to test. As 4 practitioners from ePortfolios, we already know the power of them. We don't need to work out what that looks like as another research project that has been researched for some time. But we can speculate on other development processes. And that speculation ensures that there will never be one answer. There are multiple possibilities. And that language is really important to the thinking of what this research project is and does. It also makes sure that it's usable by the CoLab. What do the 4 of us actually take from this practice? It means that we're actually learning from each other throughout the whole process, coming together. And during lockdown for Kate and I, those meetings on dark winter nights were actually really important collection spaces to come in and talk about what each of us are doing in our institutions, to learn from the other, experiences that we were working with as a team, and then to, put them into action in other projects, because these kinds of methods bleed out into the other work that we're doing all the time because it's participatory. So this is a team. And this is the underpinning question that we focused this part of the problematic on. And this is a really important proposal when you're thinking about setting up a co-design or a collaborative methodology, to think about who it is that you're going to work with and who the key stakeholders are. Each of us bring a very different role in our institutions, but a different experience of ePortfolios, from working with them with our students, or from leading institutional change, or from driving shifting practice as learning designers. And the center face I've put in here is Kelly, because working with a designer in design-based research, to me, is central. What a designer brings in terms of the ways that they think about data, they think about visualizations of data, they think about the practices of what data work actually looks like as a collaboratory is important. It's a part of their training. It's how designers work. Designers work with stakeholders. They work in communities. They don't work alone. They work in partnership continuously. And that means that those partnerships are feeding forward and feeding back information out of the group. And to me, this is one of the most important bits of thinking about what kinds of assessment digital learning might have produced, and how we might actually think about how digital portfolios or reflective-based practice post-COVID might contribute to that. So you can see that underpinning the question is portfolios. We're not asking about what portfolios can do because we know. We were thinking in a different place about how we might contribute with that question. So we use design-based research. And you probably didn't come to this session for a methodology workshop, but I think it's really important to thinking about what the opportunities of ePortfolios are and how we actually might start to think differently about the research we do in ePortfolio practice, so that we can actually achieve the kinds of policy shifts that we need. More and more in the post-COVID academy, we do need evidence of best practice. It's not about rolling out tools. It's not about shifting and the kind of slow advocacy work, because we've seen the uptake of educational technology ramp up drastically in the last 2 years, and why it was that we actually wanted to look at what was being achieved at that time, when we also saw, as a collab, massive purchasing of educational technology to support the remote emergency shift that people were doing as they went home to now start teaching. And those practices were quite radical, but how could we actually start to make some sense of what we were seeing? So the what of our project is that design-based research and prototyping provided for us a digital visual exploration of what data looked like. The reason that we chose secondary data is because, particularly during COVID, I think the ethics of collecting more data from people that are already at cognitive load is problematic. And so as a collab, what could we actually do to think about using the tremendous amounts of data that were produced during the pandemic, data about that is published by the institutions, particularly in the ways that they were producing a number of publicly available statements about what institutions were doing. Secondary data in terms of institutional data is also published broadly because that's how they develop their student experience statements. And they publish a lot of stuff. Universities also publish handbook data publicly. So the kinds of things that we could actually explore without putting the burden on anyone to ask anything during that particular time. And for anyone who works in journals right now knows how tired academics are. And so we didn't actually want to put anything on anybody, but how might we actually just use what was available to us to actually think about what we might be able to find. And that might is actually really important because we actually didn't know. And we were trusting in how the methodology, because of these rapid prototypes, enable an experimental process to think about what we could see, to then develop a proof of concept. So DBR, if you haven't worked in a design-based research methodology before, as I've said, it's collaborative. Our method of co-design is important to it. But the thing about this research, and it's been used a lot in educational technology forever, I think it's, got at least 20, 25 years worth of scholarship of teaching and learning in the educational technology space. Not a lot in ePortfolios, interestingly. It's pragmatic research. It's grounded in the site, and the site is important to that. And for us, we positioned it tightly within COVID-19 and what the shift in practice looked like. It's interactive because you're working with these stakeholders all the time. And each stakeholder is bringing new information in and out of the team. It's iterative and flexible, and it because it's speculative, it actually shifts and changes as the research is needed. It can pause and find other things and play with the data in a different way because it's actually producing data of its own as you work together. And working with a designer means that they're continuously producing new prototypes and visualizations for new data to emerge. It's integrative because you're actually pulling that work back out into your practice because you're a collab. Each four of us and with Kelly in her PhD, so the five of us as a team, we're pulling information back out and into our own practices, and how might we actually engage with those in the context that we were working in. So a quick visualization, if you haven't worked in DBR, or if you have, because I think our iteration of it is actually an interesting one. But you can see up here, and I've just circled, this co-design of knowledge is really important. Again, the labor is not on asking somebody what they know, but using stakeholders who have expertise to ask us what we know and what it is that we bring to the table and might start to explore. The bit that's sitting on the outside there is data, and how we might think differently about what data is. If you're working in ePortfolio research, do you need to go and see what the implementation looks like again? Probably not, because there's implementation research projects published for 20 to 30 years and further if you go back into paper-based portfolio research. So what other forms of data might you want to begin with? Because the beginning data is where things will start to unfold as you see this iterative process. And this is a pretty usual design thinking or design process kind of schema, where you begin with data, you come to a shared understanding, and then you play within those understandings to develop new iterations. So from that secondary data source, we develop an understanding of what we think we know, we ask new questions of it, and we begin to analyze within the co-design space what that might be able to achieve. Working with a designer is really important because what they put in here are these iterative prototypes. The prototype begins a new data cycle. So we have new data work, we explore what that data is showing us and telling us, or we think it is telling and showing us, and then we start the process over. What that means is that there's a lot of talk, a lot of thinking, a lot of exploration. And for many people who are used to big, heavy quant studies, it looks like it's stuck in thinking cycles, and it is. And to me, it's actually really important because it is how we work in ePortfolios. There's a lot of thinking about thinking, and we know that that critical engagement with our practices are incredibly important for change. And so how might we use those prototyping methods to try and change things? So it's not about testing. It's not about plugging in a theory. It's actually thinking about how design and theory mutually work with each other to support that speculative research process. And so within that thinking about thinking, within bringing each story, within finding new data, bringing it to the table, troubling it together, the designer visualizing and producing a new piece of data work for us to explore, we continue to move through the cycle. So I guess I wanted you to have a think about first how this methodology might support the kinds of troubles, wonderings, problematics you have in your own ePortfolio spaces, and who those stakeholders might be in your context. And that's the beginning of how a design-based research project might begin. So what you're wondering about, what are you troubling, who the stakeholders are, and then what the data might be, so that you can eventually land in this space where you begin to prototype together, or as Lisa Grocott calls it, figure. How do we figure out through visualizations, through this kind of visual storytelling process, to see what's emerging in the context, see what is emerging in the data work that you're doing together, and actually begin to visualize however you're doing it, whether you're doing cartographic large drawing maps, you're drawing these as digital artifacts, but continuing to draw the prototype of how the team is functioning and what's emerging in it. It's a very visual form of doing research, but what it's actually showing you continuously, the new ideas that are emerging and locating them all, so that that location of ideas is something that you can continually return to, rather than working through some kind of linear or chronological process of research, the return is important. So the return to visualization, the return to ideas that we find in the visualizations, and looking at the initial ideas that actually began this with continuously, so that you're always circling back to why this collab, why these people, why this question, and why these bits of research, so that we can follow through some kind of narrative. I'm going to stop and ask one of my colleagues if they want to add anything to our process before I move. And if anyone has a question.
I just wanted to say, as a new person to this design approach, because I'm a social scientist, I found it very invigorating, and I think the co-design approach and the iterative nature of being able to put new things into it as you went, so new learnings, and the discussions between each of us and our perspectives during this time was a very useful and more than practical, I guess. It's a inspiring way to actually do research, which I wasn't used to, because we built on things as we went. And I think the products, so-called, at the end are definitely enriched by that. And when you're dealing with such a challenging problem of assessment in COVID, this is a really excellent way to tackle something like that when you're really not quite sure where to start.
I'll just briefly mention, and thanks, Christine. I guess I'm kind of the same in the sense of that, as an instructional designer, I've been really I'm really grateful I'm able to work alongside amazing researchers, but I think it's also just made me aware of the fact that as a designer, I do this practice without necessarily being aware of it or giving name to it. And so it's been really useful for me to be able to bring the theory into my practice. One thing that I thought I might just leave people with is that Kate's been talking a lot about co-design happens in e-portfolios and things like fail stories and participatory design. But I think there's also these kind of interesting tensions and dichotomies in all of these things, in the sense of that, we've got co-design that happens in e-portfolios, but then, well, does that happen elsewhere? And if we are seeing a shift in assessment and bringing new people on board, are they necessarily thinking in the same way? And what does that mean for the types of new assessment practices we're building? If we are, taking on a fail fast kind of methodology, what does that mean for digital ethics in this space, particularly with e-portfolios? So, I'm not trying to kind of, I guess I'm just raising that as a question and something to think about, just to add more provocations to the mix.
The lovely thing about working in this space is that these troubles continue to emerge. And the research doesn't end, in a sense, once a collaboratory begins, because it just keeps going. The new provocation drops in. And with that new provocation comes new ideas. Patsy.
I'd just add to what Kate Mitchell was saying. I've been a medical research scientist since started just after I did honours, right, and part of honours. But this process was, I guess, for me, a little bit confronting, but very useful, because it made the research thinking explicit and it unpacked it. So anyone who's interested in engaging in research method should really work in this way, to have a think about what you're thinking about constantly. So it's very useful. It's a bit confronting, but when you work together with like-minded people, or you find your tribe, it becomes very, very powerful.
It's confronting because it doesn't provide answers quickly. And I think that that's what we're kind of used to in particularly in education research, that's looking for quick best practice and evidence-based, that it can fold in very fast. And it works in a different way. And as Kate said, this is usual to studio practice. What it's doing though continuously is folding out ideas, but just through a very different kind of action. It's interactive and interactive rather than it having very fast actions that turn out into products.
Yeah.
So our provocation. So I'm going to put you in the middle of us. This is where we sat at the beginning of our thinking. And I'm asking you, I guess, to think about what this looks like in terms of your context if you're entering into our collaboratory. So it begins always in a co-design with a provocation or any lab-based space that you might have worked in. So we begin with COVID-19 disrupted many of the ways we teach, assess, and innovate. Now, this is our thinking that we've used now in multiple contexts, and we shift this provocation each time we're working in the process, whether we were working with Kelly or we were working with one of the data scientists at the university. So many educators pivoted their content delivery to online spaces. However, assessment was put to the test and is potentially immature in transformation and at risk as a result in this changed world. To uncover faculty assessment practices in response to COVID-19, this research sought to explore the opportunities for innovative futures through an affordance and practice lens. Now, practice we often talk about in ePortfolios, but do we position ourselves in affordances? And this was where our speculation was landing. We know that affordances do not simply offer a range of action possibilities, they actively invite certain actions, says Argard 2018. Affordances as actions include substitution, innovation, as well as taking existing practices and understanding what these affordances can provide for authentic equivalent learning experiences. So by exploring affordances, we were speculating on the future of assessment practice and attempting to contribute to pedagogical knowledge and ePortfolio practice. What we did do was to take affordances, think about our familiarity with different digital tools that afford different actions within the online education and assessment space. And part of that data was actually looking at what people were purchasing. We had a really great discussion about just looking, if you looked globally at the purchase of ePortfolio tools in 2021, and exponential growth in Australia around the uptake of ePortfolios in Australian institutions. And it was a really interesting bit of data to look at. Now, we know that that's long game work. Obviously, the institutions had begun that pre-pandemic, but we saw all of our institutions, including the University of Melbourne, pick up a platform. Some universities that had been platform agnostic prior to that, the University of Melbourne, became a PebblePad institution in 2021. So we were watching these kinds of practices, and as stakeholders folding this into the ways that we were working in the research, we wanted to have a think about our teaching, our instruction, and our learning design during the pandemic as stakeholders in the team, and looking at the digital tools that were either enabling or constraining. So we took these 4 ways of thinking about affordances: creating content, managing content, delivering content, and assessing content. The reason that we did it is that this came from an early piece of data work where we were looking at how institutions were exploring what was happening during the pivot online. So the 2020 pivot, people started using this language of content really explicitly. Now, we know that that's not what teaching and learning is about. And we actually know as practitioners, for the 5 of us in our team, that it was way more than assessing content. But this is the type of language that we were starting to see across the institutions that we began to work with. And so in thinking about affordances, how were students navigating content? Were they consumers of content, and how? How were they actually completing tasks? And what is it that we might actually be able to think about in terms of communication of knowledge? So some data sources, and just being able to use search words inside the metadata. So we chose some universities. We wanted to have a look firstly at within our institutional collection, again in the secondary data space, what digital looked like. people were talking about digital campuses that they had never used before. Digital started to emerge as a really interesting term in 2021. Then we started to look for things like innovation. If we were talking about content, how might content actually be innovative? And what might we start to draw together from that? So we saw at UNSW that UNSW Sydney is a powerhouse of cutting edge research, teaching and innovation. These types of languages were really beginning to demonstrate what the university missions were trying to do around educational technology. And if this was a mission statement, as ePortfolio practitioners, how might we start to think about using that language to place within our ePortfolio context? So some data sources. We looked at Medium articles, so academics, particularly during pandemic, who were writing blogs a lot to push their practice out. This is what they were doing. This is what I'm changing. What could we learn from what that looked like? We looked at some academic sources and the digital affordances, because we, in a design-based research, use theory. And then we chose a data source time between March and March. We looked at these communities. So Campus Morning Mail is an important one for us in Australia, because it's a daily collection of newsletter material that comes out around the changes. So we could see, for instance, educational technology uptake, because it would be published. We could see the movement of deputy vice chancellors, pro vice chancellor messages, a whole range of information from us. Campus reviews, EDUCAUSE, ePortfolios Australia, the conversation, where we're seeing academics write about the shifts during COVID, our tertiary education quality standards, so that we could see what our institutional accreditation bodies were saying. What could we see in what was going on in Twitter in that 12 months? And Universities Australia became really important, which is where we were doing these word searches to see what each institution, in a little bit like a college yearbook, what each institution was saying was occurring in their presentation. Here's a big mega data page just to show you what it's like to sit in this high level figuring and asking questions of the things that are emerging, looking for verbs, so that we can see how the actions are actually being undertaken. What are we finding in that, and how might we understand it? How can we relate it back to a future use of technology? And working with a designer, what they were doing while the four of us literally talked and explored ideas, was that the designer was noting these and drawing each of the maps of our conversations. So the data that we now have, which is new data, was that Kelly would go in and look at what she called touch points. So things that emerged that seemed to be really important in the conversation that we had, that we could then take into a new piece, and she would visualize for us. So we have these multiple visualizations that you can see on the left, where we're seeing this world change over these 12 months. These types of questions that we're having, the data that's emerging in the project, and the visualizations where a new piece of data is being visualized for us and sent back in. So they then emerge into cleaner visualizations from Kelly that are then pushed back into us. So here's those first sets of data, the move to online. We're mapping out the kinds of languages that we've seen. So there's creating content. We're seeing enrolling students emerge, navigating content as language, and then these touch points for us. So we've got educator, the university, and the learner, and where they collide from the data, but also from our conversation that we're having. What a designer is actually able to do in sitting in the center of those important co-design or collab meetings is to pull the threads together of all of the ideas that are emerging in our conversation. So the forces around affordance and practice, which is what we were holding at the key to our question. Then came out these larger prototypes. So these slides and this session, even for me, serves as another prototyping site within design-based research. We're all back in here together having a conversation with a broader collection of people thinking about this emergent secondary data. And here's another piece of data for us to consider how we might understand practice and design interventions. And if you want to read some more about the early stages of DBR, Wang and Hanifan's 2005 work on that is really important. This prototype is one of the last prototypes that Kelly produced for us. It tightens up the touch points. It looks at learning experience over time, with learning design and digital technologies at the center of trying to focus on assessment goals. Now, what we have yet to do, and is important in our collaboration, is to think about how we take prototype 1, work with what prototype 2 emerged as, which are learner actions. So how we understand what the university's actions are, and what the learner actions are, and how we as portfolio practitioners and as academics, learning designers, instructional designers, and change makers in universities work to try and bring and find the touch points of what learners want and need, what the university is saying it's doing in its powerful statements around innovation and technology, and create opportunities for those to demonstrate that e-portfolios do that. And that's the bit of speculation for us. How can we actually demonstrate to the university that when they say we're a powerhouse of innovation, that the e-portfolio practice and pedagogy is the touch point? And that's the bit of work that each of us do in our own spaces and will continue to look at. The last prototype that Kelly developed for us is the education, university and learner, and where the intersections are. So again, these touch points for us are about e-portfolios. How do we make sure that the educator, the university and the learner touch point in their e-portfolio practice and demonstrate those intersections to actually demonstrate the affordance of e-portfolio throughout what has emerged during COVID-19. So can we go back, if we're thinking about learner, what learners' needs are around well-being, around the supports they need for coming back to campus, around metacognition, around graduate capabilities, whatever it is that we want to look at, how can we use an e-portfolio to do that and be the touch point that actually connects what the university says it wants to do, what the educator wants to achieve in the class and what the learner wants to do. And here's a larger image of what that prototype looks like that we're beginning to think about putting into action. And here's the placemat that we have used as a prototype, a group process for thinking in workshops. So these prototypes, again, in DBR, fold back out for us to use. We've already used this at the ePortfolios Australia conference with colleagues to think about the role of what comes in as a touch point. So activities around creating content and navigating content, from educator at the top, student at the bottom, what's the touch point in the center so that we can get the experience timeline right. Consuming content, completing tasks, communicating. And you see that's the language that we found in our earlier stages in the research. So speculative lets us unpack, it lets us solve, it lets us challenge. And it really lets us think differently about what might come out of this. And you know, in the spaces that we worked in, how might we use this kind of research to think differently? We're contributing to methodology, and I think our contribution to methodology is important as ePortfolio practitioners and leaders in this space. How might we shift an understanding of educational research and methodology to contribute into what digital methods are, assessment literacies are, what digital learning needs are, and what the practices of learning models might be. But more importantly, we have identified digital tools and programs used in teaching and learning in these 6 universities. We've identified some really important aspects in that data search. We have located the kinds of languages that universities are using, and we know that we need to use that language to flip it back to demonstrate what ePortfolios afford in terms of learning and teaching. And to do this, we have some big challenges ahead of us. We've observed that while assessment is mapped backwards, online learning is experienced forwards, tethered by learning design and afforded by digital technologies. We've translated online digital technologies and seen that they're defined by their ability to create, deliver, manage, assess, but not necessarily mapped to technology. And we got this from mapping handbook data, which is really interesting when you look at what an institution says the assessment is. We've observed that while assessments are more likely to be end of semester, we need to think about what the categories of formative assessment are that we saw emerge during COVID. Quite big changes occurred during not published in assessment data, but published by the universities because they're saying things, and found in Christine Slade's work in 2021. There's a contradiction between pedagogy of teaching, learning, and summative assessment, and what it is that we teach and what's assessed. And this has been very present in all of the work that we brought to the table from our 4 contexts. And that, to use Christine's words here, connecting pedagogy to assessment is essential for dialogic feedback processes, peer learning and assessment for learning linked to lifelong learning, and developing evaluative judgment. And there is a need to argue for flexible, digitally enabled modes of interaction to connect learning with assessment. And that's our key, touch point for us to actually continue this research and locate it back in the ePortfolio practice space within our institutions. And that's the end.
Amazing. Well, I want to thank Kate, Patsy, and Christine for really, I did not expect to walk away with a research protocol that I may have to apply to something where the application is due August 3rd. So I have to learn quite a bit about DBR to see if I can pull it off. But thank you so much. This has been a great session. I want to make space for you to share any last resources. The chat has been just a cornucopia of goodies where we will be scraping that and posting it with the recording for this session. But if there are things that you don't believe got in there, then absolutely share it out. For those of you out west, we do have more. So there's one more session, and I think Patsy's going to lead it in just 9 minutes in room number 1 for the ABLE conference. So we hope to see all of you there. And I'm going to stop the recording now, and I'll stay in here just a couple minutes to see if there's anything else people want to say, do, or share.
I just want to say thank you so much. I just took 100 screenshots of your presentation. I feel like the collaborative kind of meta high level approach you took to the lexicon building, the sense making, all of it, it's gorgeous. It makes me jealous. And also right at the end, when you said, and that's the end, I thought, that's the beginning. So yay, amazing. I'm blown away. What an amazing project. And I am sad that I'm not in your time zone to chat with you more about it, but I am just so proud of the work you've done. And I think it's going to inform a lot of work here in the US too. Let's hope it does, because it's excellent. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. It is just the beginning.